Do you think you're conscious at this very moment? You probably answered yes without hesitation. After all, you're here, reading these words, processing ideas, maybe even reflecting on your own inner experience. It seems obvious that you possess consciousness. But what if I told you that this absolute certainty might be one of the greatest illusions our mind creates? What if the very experience of being conscious is vastly different from what we imagine? Yuval Harari, in his reflections on the nature of human consciousness, invites us to question one of our most fundamental beliefs about ourselves. And the answer may be deeply disturbing. Imagine for a moment that you're driving to work on the same route you've taken for years. Suddenly, you realize you've arrived at your destination without consciously remembering the last 15 minutes of the journey. You were on autopilot, as we say. But where was your consciousness during that time? Were you unconscious? Obviously not, because you reacted to traffic, stopped at red lights, made turns. So what exactly does it mean to be conscious? This everyday experience gives us a clue about something much deeper and more unsettling about the nature of our own mind. To understand the depth of this issue, we need to go back to the roots of how humans developed the notion of consciousness. For thousands of years, our philosophical and religious traditions built elaborate narratives about what it means to have a conscious mind. The ancient Greeks spoke of the rational soul. Hindus developed sophisticated concepts about different levels of awareness, and the Abrahamic traditions placed the conscious soul as what sets us apart from all other beings. These traditions, however different in detail, shared a fundamental premise: human consciousness is something special, unified, and clearly defined. You are either conscious or you are not. But here lies the first major misunderstanding Harari identifies. Consciousness is not a switch that is simply on or off. It is not a single coherent entity residing in a specific part of your brain like a tiny inner director watching the movie of your life. This image, which almost all of us intuitively carry, is fundamentally incorrect. Modern neuroscience shows us that what we call consciousness is actually an extremely fragmented, distributed, and discontinuous process. Think about your experience right now. You likely feel there is a central self observing your thoughts, processing the information from this text, making decisions about whether to continue reading or stop. But neuroscientists have discovered something fascinating. There is no specific location in the brain where this experience of being you happens. There is no command center where an internal observer watches your experience. Instead, different regions of the brain process different aspects of visual, auditory, emotional, and memory experience in parallel and often in an uncoordinated manner. The sense of having a unified consciousness is literally an illusion created by the brain itself. This discovery has profound implications that go far beyond neuroscience. If consciousness isn't what we think it is, then who or what is really in control of our decisions? Harari points to studies showing that many of our choices are made by unconscious systems in the brain before our conscious mind becomes aware of them. What we experience as deciding something consciously is often just our rational mind justifying decisions already made by automatic and unconscious processes. Consider a simple experiment you can observe yourself. Next time you're walking, pay attention to how you decide where to look. You don't consciously plan to move your eyes left or right, up or down. Your visual systems are constantly scanning the environment, processing information, and directing your attention without your conscious command. Yet you feel like you're choosing where to look. This is a miniature version of what happens with most of our mental processes. But if this is true, what happens to our notion of free will? If we are not the conscious authors of our decisions in the way we imagine, are we truly responsible for our actions? Harari does not suggest we should completely abandon the idea of individual responsibility, but he proposes we need a more sophisticated understanding of how our mind actually works. The problem isn't that we have no control, but that the type of control we have is very different from what our intuition tells us. The question becomes even more complex when we consider how modern technology is beginning to interact with these unconscious processes of the mind. The digital platforms we use daily are not trying to persuade our rational, conscious mind. They are designed to hack the automatic and unconscious systems that truly drive our behavior. When you feel an irresistible urge to check your phone or find yourself endlessly scrolling through a social network, these are not failures of your conscious willpower. They are evidence that external systems have gained direct access to the unconscious mechanisms that control your attention and behavior. This reality forces us to confront a disturbing question. If our consciousness is not the control center we imagine it to be, and if external systems can influence our unconscious processes, what does this mean for our autonomy as human beings? Harari argues that we are entering an era where understanding the real nature of consciousness is no longer just an abstract philosophical issue, but an urgent practical necessity for preserving our freedom. The artificial intelligence revolution adds another layer of complexity to this issue. As we develop machines that can simulate increasingly sophisticated aspects of human cognition, we are forced to confront fundamental questions about what makes consciousness special. If an AI can process language, recognize patterns, even demonstrate something that seems like creativity, what exactly distinguishes human consciousness? The answer might be far less comforting than we expected. One possibility Harari explores is that consciousness, as we experience it, may be more like a narrative our mind creates about itself than a fundamental reality. Just as we create stories to make sense of external events in our lives, it may be that we create the story of unified consciousness to make sense of the fragmented and chaotic internal processes of our brain. This narrative is useful. It allows us to function as social beings, make decisions, form relationships, but it may not reflect the underlying reality of how our mind truly operates. If this is true, then what we experience as our personal identity, our sense of being a continuous self, over time may be more flexible and constructed than we imagine. This realization opens both liberating and frightening possibilities. On one hand, it suggests we have more capacity to transform our mental experience than we thought. On the other, It raises deep questions about what it means to be human in a world where our traditional understanding of consciousness is constantly being challenged. Meditation and other contemplative practices, which have existed for thousands of years, have long pointed to this illusory nature of unified consciousness. Experienced practitioners often report moments where the sense of a solid, separate self temporarily dissolves, revealing a much more fluid and interconnected mental reality. What's new is that modern science is arriving at similar conclusions through completely different methods. This convergence between ancient contemplative wisdom and contemporary neuroscientific research suggests that we may be approaching a more accurate understanding of the real nature of the human mind. But this understanding comes with enormous practical challenges. If our experience of consciousness is largely a mental construction, how should we structure our societies, our legal systems, our education? How do we maintain notions of moral and individual responsibility in a world where we understand that the individual is far more fragmented and influenceable than we previously thought? Harari suggests that we need to develop new models of how humans operate, models that are simultaneously more realistic about our psychological nature and more compassionate about our limitations. One particularly important implication concerns education and personal development. If much of what happens in our minds occurs below the threshold of consciousness, then traditional strategies for behavioral change that rely solely on conscious willpower are doomed to fail. Instead, we need to learn how to work with the unconscious systems of the mind, developing habits and environments that automatically support the behaviors we desire, rather than constantly fighting against our automatic impulses. This also has implications for how we think about mental health and well-being. Many forms of psychological suffering may be related to the conflict between our actual experience of a fragmented mind and our cultural expectation of having a unified and controlled consciousness. When we judge ourselves for not perfectly controlling our thoughts and emotions, we may be judging ourselves for not achieving something that is fundamentally impossible. A more realistic understanding of how the mind works could lead to more effective and compassionate approaches to psychological well-being. The question of consciousness also intersects with contemporary political and social challenges. In an era of extreme polarization and misinformation, understanding how our mind actually processes information becomes crucial. If our beliefs and opinions are primarily formed by unconscious and automatic processes, then strategies that rely solely on presenting rational facts to change minds are doomed to fail. We need to develop more sophisticated approaches to communication and persuasion that acknowledge how human beings actually function, not how we wish they did. But perhaps the deepest implication of Harari's perspective on consciousness is existential. If our experience of being a conscious and unified self is largely an illusion that does not make our life less meaningful, on the contrary, it may free us from unrealistic expectations about what it means to be human. Instead of struggling to maintain an impossible image of total control over our inner experience, we can learn to work with the reality of having a complex, fragmented, and often contradictory mind. This understanding can also make us more humble and compassionate with ourselves and with others. If we are all navigating with a consciousness that is far less clear and controlled than it seems, then we all deserve patience and understanding when we fail to live up to our ideals. Conscious perfection is not the normal human standard. It is a psychological impossibility. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the illusory nature of our unified consciousness does not have to lead to nihilism or despair. Instead, it can invite us to a more fluid and experimental way of being. If our identity is more constructed than fixed, this means we have more freedom to reinvent ourselves than we imagined. If our mental experience is more malleable than we thought, it opens possibilities for forms of being we haven't yet fully explored. Harari invites us to see this discovery about consciousness not as a loss, but as an opportunity. The opportunity to stop fighting against the true nature of our mind and start working with it. The opportunity to develop technologies, societies, and personal practices that are based on a more accurate understanding of how human beings actually work, and perhaps most importantly, the opportunity to find ways of living that are simultaneously more realistic and more compassionate. So, returning to the initial question, are you conscious? The answer may be that this is the wrong question. The right question might be, how can we live more wisely, knowing that our consciousness is far more complex, fragmented, and mysterious than we ever imagined? And how can we use this understanding to create lives and societies that honor both our real nature and our highest aspirations? I need to pause here to ask something that might be echoing in your mind at this moment. Have you ever felt that strange sensation of observing your own thoughts as if you were a spectator of your own mental experience? That sense that there is a you watching the processes of your mind? I know many of us experience this regularly, but we rarely stop to question what it really means. If this feeling resonates with you, share in the comments. I feel like I observe my own thoughts when your experience may be exactly what someone else needs to read to realize they are not alone in this fascinating confusion about our own mental nature. The journey to understand consciousness is just beginning, and each individual perspective adds a valuable piece to this complex puzzle. If these reflections on the illusory nature of our unified consciousness have sparked your curiosity about other aspects of the human condition we may have misunderstood, you'll find a community of equally fascinated people here. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring the deepest mysteries of our existence together, always with the goal of living more wisely and compassionately in a world that constantly invites us to rethink what it means to be human. We are not just studying consciousness, we are discovering who we truly are beneath the illusions our own mind creates about itself. This extremely cynical view of humans is not true. Yes, humans are interested in power to some extent in some situations, but this is not the only thing that we want. We are not power-crazy demons. If you look at yourself, start with yourself. Mm-hmm. If I look at myself, do I want power in life? Yes, in some situations I want. This is not the only thing. I really want to know the truth about myself, my life, the world. And the key reason for that
is that if you don't know the truth about yourself, you can never be happy. Because you don't know what are the sources of misery in your life, and you can't solve them.
The most important taboo of the global liberal order was that strong countries cannot just invade and conquer other countries by force of arms just because they are stronger. It has been, I would say, the most amazing political and maybe moral achievement of humankind. And the place to see that it was a reality is in government budgets. You know, people talk about peace and war, and they think about, you know, all these pacifist literature or poetry. Don't read poetry, read government budgets. And government budgets over the last 20 or 30 years have been the most amazing thing to read. More than 80% of the budget of the Roman Empire was spent on soldiers, warships, fortresses, weapons. And this was the situation until the 20th century. In the early 20th century, more than 50% is spent on the military. In the early 21st century, all over the world, taking all countries, the average expenditure went down to between 6 and 7%. Compared to 10% average spent on healthcare. It was the first time in human history that governments spent more money on healthcare than on the military. And it was all based on this basic taboo that, okay, there are civil wars, there are revolts, revolutions, we didn't solve all problems. But one thing is off the table. You cannot invade and conquer another country just because you're stronger. And this taboo has now been broken.
Are you positive, are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic for our future? I know it's a hard question
I try to be a realist. I mean, basically optimism is like saying, oh, everything will be okay. And pessimism, no, we are all doomed. Both these positions, they make us abdicate responsibility. If in the end everything will be okay, why bother? You don't need to take action. And it's the same if we are doomed, so why waste whatever little time we have on taking action? Realism is understanding that we have, as human beings, as a human species, we still have the resources, the technology, the wisdom to deal with major challenges, whether it's climate change or whether it's the rise of AI.